Good afternoon. This is a Devar Torah on Parshat Kedoshim. Prior to starting the Devar Torah, I would like to explain the following. Last week, the Torah Parsha differed between Israel and outside of Israel. In Israel, we read Pesach finished on Thursday night, Friday, and in Shabbat, we read the next Torah Parsha, which was Akrim Mos, in which I presented the Devar Torah last week, which was sent out. This week, I'm doing a Devar Torah on Parshat Kedoshim, which will be read in Eretz Israel this week, but outside of Eretz Israel will be read next week. And this difference will be for 3 months. So in terms of when one wants to listen to this Devar Torah, for those from Chutz La'aretz, I already presented what will be for you in Chutz La'aretz outside of Israel next week, and for this week for those in Eretz Israel. Now, Parshat Kedoshim is short but very interesting Parsha. It begins with the following. It starts with V'diber Adonai el Moshe lemor, Dver el kol edus b'nei Yisrael, Amras lahem kodeshim tiyeh ki kodesh ani, Adonai alechem. Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, speak to the entire assembly of the children of Israel and say to them, you should be holy, for I am Hashem, your God. For holy am I, Hashem, your God. Now, this was a very unusual commandment to Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, because in normal situation, God would privately command a new commandment mitzvah to Moshe. He would then teach it to Aaron, his sons, and the Zikanim, the 70 elders, and they would then transmit it to the rest of the population. Here, God is commanding that Moshe assemble the entire people and tell them to simultaneously. Now, this has only happened twice, 2 other times in the Chumash and the Torah. One of those was at the time of the presenting of the giving of the Torah, the presenting of the Seros of Dibros, which we commemoration which we were observing on the holiday of Shavuos. The second time is most of Sefer Devarim, where Moshe in his last 30 days of life will be presenting teachings to the entire people, and particularly in Parshas Veichanan, he will be repeating and elaborating on the Seros of Dibros, the 10 Commandments. Now, and in fact, according to the Midrashim, Midrash Rabbah specifically, either in specific form, where it's obviously discernible, or in hidden form, all of the Seros of Dibros, the 10 Commandments, are included in this Parsha. And what I would like to read, and it then goes on, the Parsha, to describe, very interestingly, many different types of mitzvahs. Some of those are Adam L'Chaveiro, one to one's fellow man or woman, one's neighbor, and how to deal with them. Also, various acts of kindness by leaving parts of one's crop in the fields in different ways that they will be able to collect them with pride and not be taking direct handouts. It also deals with how more general relationships with one's neighbors. And also, besides those types of mitzvahs, there are also mitzvahs, commandments, that are a little less, those can be understood by logic, emulating kindness and improving relations from neighbor to neighbor. However, there are others, laws there. For example, the law of shatnez, that one shall not have mixed garments of wool and linen. One should not mix crossbreed animals, mix crops of different types in the same field, different types of grain. And these are a little less clear. One would not derive these, in other words, by any human logic. They still have to be observed, but again, would not be derived by human logic. Now, what I'd like to focus on are a few different concepts in the Parsha. The first one I would like to refer to is where it says, the first mitzvah that's specifically mentioned, Ish v'imo aviv tira'u and es shabasas tishramu ani Hashem, and that every man, your mother and father shall you revere, and my Sabbaths you should observe. I am Hashem your God. These are two of the 10 commandments, which are here mentioned explicitly. Now, why are those two brought together? There's many different explanations and connections. In other words, one is by keeping the Sabbath, one is recognizing Hashem's Kedoshim central role, and also honoring thy father and thy mother is considered in the same category. However, one other explanation that's given of this is with Rashi, who explains that the Sabbath is a day of rest and is a day when one can truly spend time learning Torah, and one is creating not only respect for his parents, but giving great happiness whether the parents are alive or in the next world, that the more Torah they see learned by the children, the happier they will be. The next one I would like to focus on is a different mitzvah, which is talking about Orla. Now, Orla is the practice where one plants a fruit tree, one cannot eat from the fruits for the first 3 years. The fourth year, one cannot eat of the fruits, must offer them as offering a gift to God, and only in the fifth year can they eat of the fruits, pick and eat of the fruits of the tree. Now, one could argue this from an agricultural point of view, that it could deplete a tree if it's too young, and by allowing it to develop properly, it's going to produce better fruit. However, there are things much more deeply hidden in this, and again is showing Hashem's, again recognizing Hashem's holiness, again hopefully inspiring us to get closer to God. Now, let's look at this law more specifically. This is based on the commentary of the of the Evan Yushiv. He was a commentator from the period of the Rishonim. He was a Talmud of the Rashba, and presumably it also was a Talmud of the Ramban, or Talmud of the Ramban. In any event, he explains that there is a much deeper meaning here. And he says that the 3 years of the Ola go to represent or an entity in themselves. And what is it referring to? In other words, they're one type of light, one type of Hashem's, the respect of Hashem's holiness, because this is showing the seal, because if one looks, you're sealing them away from you, and you're covering, they're covered. We're talking about both the flesh of the fruit and that we keep the fruit away from us. And how does that reflect this Hashem's glory? Because what it's showing is that Hashem, unlike a human king, wants to keep his honor hidden. It's a hidden thing. In other words, earthly kings like to, most of them anyway, even constitutional kings like the today constitutional monarchs, like to get attention, like to be recognized like any other human. What Hashem is seeking is something very different. He, being modest, does not like to reveal it openly. In fact, part of the whole creation is for us to find him and see him, his presence in the world. Because, as we see in Mishlei, this is Proverbs, this concept is expressed because it says in this 25th chapter, Parshat to verse 2, that Kever Elokim Hista Devar Kavod Malakim Halka Devar. The honor of the king is to conceal a matter, whereas the honor of kings, that of God, the way the honor of kings is to search out a matter. In other words, he doesn't go looking for glory, he wants us to find him. Now, what does the 4th year represent? The 4th year, now we're going from Hashem being hidden, concealing himself into this world. We then go up one level, and it explains literally the arms or the shoulders of the universe. In other words, how does Hashem manifest himself? And he manifests himself through the creation, which he did on the first day, of the heavens and the earth. And the heavens and the earth are the way he can be acknowledged and recognized. And these, as it says, Biyom Sod Hashem Elokim et Aretz v'Shemaim, created the earth, he created the heavens. And this is not the first pasuk, this is actually in the 2nd chapter of Bereshis, where the story of creation is elaborated on more. And though after already Adam and Chava have been created, and it is very interesting that those are effectively the chariots of Hashem. In other words, the chariots, the way in which Hashem, through them, interacts, has made a creation and interacts with the human race. Now, the 5th year, and then we praise Hashem. Now that we've seen His heaven and earth, we can start praising Hashem. Now, the 5th year is going upwards from when Hashem created the universe, because prior to Hashem's creating the universe, there was a 2,000-year period before creation when Hashem had created the Torah. And then at 2,000 years later, He created the universe as we understood it, which we just discussed. And He then, at the beginning, created what's called a kav, a space in which an existence separate from Hashem could exist. That became the beginning of the spiritual worlds, which eventually go down to our physical world of Asiya. Now, to create that, He created what was called halal, the space, and then there was a kav where He started the creation that we now see, the beginning of creation, and then it's spreading until it became all of the physical, spiritual universes, worlds, and the physical world. And because of that, He has ever increasingly given us abundance. And everything we have in the world today, all life, started from there. And that is the ultimate level of Hashem's creation. And this is the ultimate level of Hashem. And if one can recognize or have some understanding of this, one has again become holier, and is trying to follow Hashem's holiness as much as a human individual can. Now, so the purpose, as we said at the beginning, was to become holy. And the Seros Adibros, the whole Torah, was the way of becoming holy. Now, why then, at the end of the Parsha, does it say the following Pesukim? Where it says, last two Pesukim, seems to be a repetition. Ha'iti Kodeshim ki Kodesh ani, Anoy Avdal etchem min hamin lahayot li. Ish or isha yeh behem ov or yedani mos yemoso be'evan yirmu otam v'dehem va. You should be holy for me, because I am Hashem, am holy, and He separated you from the peoples to be mine. Now, that first part of that already seems to be a repetition of what we said at the beginning of the Parsha. And then it goes on, any man or woman whom there shall be sorcery or ov or yudoni, they shall be put to death. They shall pelt them with stones. Their blood is upon themselves. Now, why does this appear at the end of the Parsha? It's making a very good point. If we become holy and kept the law, all the laws of the Torah, the Jewish people will be elevating themselves. I mean, they'll still be a light unto the nations. However, it's warning that if we take on the ways of the nations, we will suffer. We will suffer. And as explained by the Rav Chaim Volozhin, this verse guarantees that if we separate ourselves from the nation, he guarantees he will separate, if we keep his ways, he will separate us from nations and will be his people. Now, to be his, what will happen if we don't sanctify ourselves? As the next pasuk says, there's going to be all kinds of penalties. Now, a similar theme was written by the Or Sameach, who was Rav Meir Simcha Cohen, who, in very long commentary, explains that if we do not separate ourselves from the nations, nations will separate themselves from us. Now, what is that device called? It's called anti-Semitism, or as I'd like to put it, there's a centrifugal force built into the system by God that if we do not separate from the nations, then the anti-Semitism will arrive, we assimilate with them, and they will separate us through usually persecution, and as I'll explain in a minute, sometimes by other means. And we see that throughout the history of the Jewish people. At the prototype of all the exiles, our travels through history, was with the Egyptian exile, which we just finished observing and talking about on Pesach, and the Levium. They stayed in the land of Goshen and learned Torah. They were persecuted occasionally, like with the killing of the firstborn, but they did not, were not enslaved. Now, the rest of the tribes of Yaakov went out into the world, started assimilating into their culture, into their banks, into their methods of industry, and the Pharaoh, as the prototype anti-Semite, encouraged his people to separate from us and persecute us and enslave us. We see that also at the time of the first exile of the 4 exiles, when the Babylonians destroyed the first temple and exiled us. Why? We were taking on the idolatrous practices of the nations surrounding us, including and committing major sins such as spilling blood, idol worship, various types of immorality. And that continued with the Persians, which the idea of that is written up when we try to assimilate with them, and the story of Megillah Esther. And now the 3rd exile, which was in Greece, was an interesting one. That was not one where the Greeks were trying to physically destroy us that occupied Israel. They wanted to separate us, destroy us in an even more insidious way than our bodies, was to adopt their culture and forgo the Torah. It was only through the miraculous events of Hanukkah that we survived that. Now, in the 4th exile, which includes elements of the 3 exiles, the exile we're living in now, the people of Hashem's nation have been attacked in 2 different ways. Primarily, every time we tried assimilating, the nations rejected us, persecuted us, killed us, exiled us. One example, of course, is the Spanish Inquisition. Jewish people became very powerful in Spain. That raised all kinds of anti-Semitism and led to our expulsion in 1492 on Tisha B'Av. The prototype, of course, is the Holocaust, where 6 million of the people were killed. And again, there was massive assimilation in both Europe and North America. And that is the usual method. However, there is another method, and that other method is encouraging us to abandon our ways. So we not only have the brutality of the Babylonians and to a certain extent the Persians, we also see this current exile of the member of the Greeks invite us to abandon the Torah and the mitzvahs and moving away from being Hashem's people. And this assimilation has caused wide consequences. And as we are entering the period of between Pesach and Shavuos, may we draw ever closer to Hashem and come closer to Him in His mitzvahs and the Torah. Shabbat Shalom and good Shabbos.